In 1958, the federal government appears to have sold 47 minutes of tomorrow. That is the dramatic version of the file. The ordinary version is much duller. It is a procurement folder. Beige paper, typed schedules, vendor initials, routing slips, and one contract number that looks like every other contract number in the drawer. The work description is almost designed to be ignored. Time signal continuity support. No weapons. No aircraft. No code names on the cover. Just time. But halfway down the award sheet, in a column usually reserved for equipment access, there is a phrase that should not be there. Priority correction window. Beside it, written by hand, is a number. 47 minutes. The first assumption is clerical. Someone misfiled a radio maintenance contract. Someone copied the wrong figure from a frequency table. Someone meant 47 seconds or 47 channels or $47 per hour. That would have been the clean explanation. Then the name appears, Edward L. Noon. He is listed as the bidder, the signatory, and the responsible officer for a company that seems to have had no engineers, no radio tower, no laboratory, and no manufacturing address. Its office was a rented room. Its phone was answered by a switchboard. Its business records, if they existed, do not appear in the ordinary places. And yet this company won access to a part of American infrastructure that almost nobody thinks about until it fails. Official time. Not the clock on a wall. The time that moves through radio signals, dispatch rooms, laboratories, market slips, message forms, station logs, hotel registers, and military paperwork. The time that turns an event into a sequence. The time that lets a record say, this happened first, and that happened after. To understand Project Noon, you have to start there. By the late 1950s, time was no longer only a human habit. It was becoming an infrastructure. Laboratories were refining atomic standards. Radio stations were distributing time and frequency signals. Ships, broadcasters, engineers, rail systems, research stations, and government offices were learning to depend on a common answer to a simple question. What time is it, officially? That word matters, officially. Because a private clock can be wrong and nothing happens. A wristwatch can gain a minute and only embarrass the person wearing it. But an official timestamp becomes evidence. It enters a ledger. It enters a message chain. It enters a dispatch log. It proves where someone was when an order was received, whether a train had moved, whether a signal had arrived before or after a meeting. Time stops being a number. It becomes a witness. The Noon file is built around that witness. The surviving papers never call the project time travel. They never say prediction. They never describe a machine that sees the future. The language is colder than that. Correction, offset, priority, reconciliation. Those are bureaucratic words, and that is what makes them dangerous. They do not claim to change events. They claim to repair records. In most systems, correction is ordinary. A station clock drifts, a relay is delayed, a log is copied late, a clerk receives a signal after a line outage and marks the proper time. The archive accepts these repairs because it has to. No large institution can function if every clock error becomes a scandal. Project Noon appears to have taken that ordinary trust and turned it into an instrument. The purchase was not a clock. It was not a tower. It was not even a broadcast. What Edward L. Noon seems to have purchased was the right to be first inside the correction window. For 47 minutes after selected time-sensitive records were created, the official version could still be reconciled. A timestamp could be adjusted. A delayed receipt could be made clean. A local log could be brought into agreement with a national signal. A contradiction could be made to look like an error that had already been fixed. That sounds small until you ask what a timestamp is doing in a spy file. There is a train movement record attached to the first example. 2 ledgers, same route, same night, same equipment number. In one ledger, the rail car leaves a transfer yard after a courier is already reported across town. In the other ledger, the same movement appears 41 minutes earlier. The difference is not large enough to rewrite a day. It is just large enough to change an alibi. The file does not explain which ledger is true. It does not have to. The point is that both ledgers can be made official depending on which clock is allowed to become the source. That is the first Noon principle. If you can choose the correction, you can choose the sequence. The second example is financial. A confirmation strip appears in the archive with a time printed before the request slip beside it. Under ordinary circumstances, that is impossible. An order cannot be confirmed before it is given. A clerk cannot stamp what has not arrived, but inside a correction window, impossibility becomes paperwork. One sheet is local time, one sheet is corrected time, one sheet is the time the clerk saw, one sheet is the time the system later agreed to remember. No one has to lie, they only have to reconcile. The third example is a message form. A receiving office logs a short military communication before the sending station records transmission, not by hours, not by a dramatic amount, by less than the window. If you were looking for a conspiracy, it would be disappointing. If you were looking for proof in a hostile archive, it would be devastating, because now every question has a second question behind it. Was the message early? Was the sender late? Was the relay delayed? Was the record corrected? Or was the correction itself the operation? Project Noon lived in that uncertainty. The most human example is a hotel register. There is nothing cinematic about it. A desk bell, a room key, a printed receipt, a narrow column for time. Someone signs in at a place where another record suggests he could not have arrived yet. Again, the gap is not enormous. 47 minutes is rarely enough to make a miracle. It is enough to make doubt, and doubt is often more useful than a miracle. If the purpose were simple fraud, Noon would be crude. Move a trade, clean an alibi, fix a dispatch, hide an order, but the deeper papers suggest a stranger purpose. Noon may not have been built to help one side lie. It may have been built to make stolen truth harder to use. Imagine a hostile service captures a file. Inside it are schedules, messages, logs, receipt times, station movements, travel confirmations, and meeting records. An analyst lays them out on a table and begins to build the most important thing intelligence can build: sequence. Who knew first? Who moved next? Which office reacted? Which source was protected? Which courier was already gone before the order arrived? The analyst is not only reading information, he is reading time. Project Noon appears to have attacked that reading, not by destroying the file, not by removing the evidence, by making the order expensive. If every timestamp inside a sensitive window might be original time, corrected time, relay time, local time, or noon time, then the file stops behaving like a map. It becomes a room of clocks, all close enough to be plausible, none trustworthy enough to convict. This is where the project becomes counterintelligence. The most elegant deception is not the one that fools the enemy into believing a false fact. It is the one that makes the enemy unsure which true fact came first. One note in the folder uses a phrase that appears nowhere else: sequence denial. The line is almost entirely surrounded by redaction, but the meaning is clear enough. Noon was not only about moving times, it was about denying sequence to anyone outside the correction authority. If a hostile service stole the wrong folder, the folder would still look valuable. It would still contain names, cities, codes, times, and movements. But when the analyst tried to build a chain, the chain would not lock. Every link could move by less than an hour, enough to spoil causality, enough to protect a source. Enough to make a meeting look like a response, or a response look like a warning. Enough to make history argue with itself. That brings the file back to Edward L. Noon. For most of the folder, Noon looks like a man. He signs procurement forms. He appears on vendor lists. He receives notices. His initials sit beside technical approvals. A contractor file refers to his office. A routing slip marks him as responsible for delivery. But the closer the file is read, the less body he has. There is no photograph. There is no personnel record. There is no payroll trail. His address changes form without changing location. In one document it is a business suite. In another it is a relay office. In another it appears to be a records annex. The signatures are similar enough to pass at a glance and different enough to make comparison irritating. Noon is everywhere a contractor needs to be, and nowhere a person would have been. The final clue is not hidden in a dramatic memo. It is written on a routing card, probably by a clerk who did not know it mattered. Noon is typed in capital letters, not as a surname, as a unit label. National Offset Operations Node. That is the moment the story turns. Edward L. Noon was not the man who bought 47 minutes of tomorrow. He was the paper shape of the system that already owned the correction. The government did not sell time to a private contractor. It created a private contractor so the ownership of the window could be denied. If Project Noon surfaced, the scandal would be simple. A vendor abused a technical support contract. A strange bidder received improper access. A procurement officer made a mistake. The contract could be terminated. The file could be closed. The name Edward L. Noon could absorb the blame because he had no body to defend and no body to question. The paper man was the escape hatch. That is why the contract looks so ordinary. It was not meant to impress anyone. It was meant to be boring enough to survive and small enough to sacrifice. The closing material says the program ended in 1964. At least that is the official time of the ending. The language is familiar by then. Access discontinued. Correction authority withdrawn. Vendor file closed. But a program built to make timestamps uncertain leaves a particular problem for anyone trying to prove its death. The ending is also a record. The record is also a timestamp. And the timestamp is the thing Project Noon was built to make conditional. The final object in the archive is a clock hand. Not a full clock. Just one hand, wrapped in paper, stopped at 12. It sits beside a blank contractor badge and a folder tab with the name Noon typed cleanly across it. There is no confession. No final memo explains the trick. No engineer writes that the system worked. But the folder leaves a quieter question. If official time is the witness, what happens when the witness can be corrected before it testifies? Project Noon did not predict the future. It made the past inadmissible.